Okay, good morning. Time now a few minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Friday, May 28th, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group Morning Seminar organized by the World Bank Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of online seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time, introducing the latest report presented by the World Bank Group economists and specialists. On May 12th, about 2 weeks ago, the latest edition of the Migration and Development Brief, 34th edition of it, was released by the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, NOMAD, a global hub for policy and knowledge on migration and development issues housed by the World Bank. Connecting from Washington, we have Dilip Rasa, the lead economist and head of NOMAD. Dilip, how are you? Thank you very much for joining this evening from Washington time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great. Dilip, this is your second appearance in our morning seminar programs, and we definitely want to continue this, making this as a tradition to keep featuring the further new report, the edition of the migration report. So the report is subtitled Resilience and COVID-19 Crisis Through a Migration Lens. In fact, last night in Tokyo time, a global launch event of the new report was organized virtually. So we'll listen to Dilip presenting the main point of the report in the next 30-40 minutes. For Dilip, this is his second presentation about the same report on the same day. And then typically, one would get sharper and sharper in presenting the same report on the same presentation on the same day. So we are taking advantage of him, repeating the presentation for the Japanese audience this morning. After his presentation, I'll read the questions sent from our viewers. And thank you very much for sending those questions in advance. If you did not have opportunity to send your own questions to Dilip, please send them using online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can post your question on the chat section on the YouTube screen. I'll read those questions and ask Dilip to respond after his presentation. So with that, I'd like to formally invite Dilip to come in to start his presentation. Dilip, over to you.
Thank you, Koichi. Much appreciated. I will use the PowerPoint. So let me try to show the PowerPoint to you. And I want to confirm that you are able to see as well as hear what I'm showing. Are you able to see the PowerPoint, Koichi?
Yes, and probably you may want to put it in a full screen mode.
Okay. I am trying to do that. Share, stop sharing. Just give me 1 second, please. I am having some difficulty. Why? File share. All right. You have to just bear with me for a second. I will share it. Is that better?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Very good. So the report that we released on May 12th, this is the Migration and Development Brief 34, number 34. This is titled Resilience, COVID-19 Crisis Through a Migration Lens. This is the third in the series. The first one was the phase 1, COVID-19 crisis through the migration lens, and then phase 2 in October. And then now we have put the title Resilience. And that is the main sort of message of the main finding of the report, that remittances actually proved to be more resilient than we were expecting. And there was a decline of only 1.6% in 2020 not a 20% decline or 7% decline that we had previously predicted. And that remittances are expected to grow by 2.6% this year, and again by little over 2% next year in 2022. That said, there are significant downside risks to the flow of remittances, this outlook, the positive outlook. And that implies that we would need to have global efforts to keep remittances flowing and to help migrants. But compared to 2019, the gap between remittances and foreign direct investment actually widened further. Foreign direct investment declined by 11% last year in 2020. Remittances declined by only 1.6%. Now, if we exclude the from the list of low and middle income countries, if we exclude China, then the difference between remittances and foreign direct investment becomes sharper. And indeed, 2020 marked a huge milestone in the sense that remittances now, excluding China, surpassed the sum of foreign direct investment flows as well as official development assistance. This is a remarkable moment because remittances are no longer a small change. They cannot be ignored anymore because foreign direct investment has responded to the crisis by declining, and official aid has increased, but not by a lot. The resilience of remittances has resulted in the flow of remittances exceeding the sum of foreign direct investment and official development assistance. This is a remarkable fact. Now, the top remittance recipients in the world globally are India, China, Mexico, Philippines, Egypt. India alone received $83 billion in 2020. However, if we look at remittances as a share of GDP, it is smaller countries like Tonga, Lebanon, Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, El Salvador, where remittances are as a share of GDP over 24% or as high as 38%. In fact, the top 10 share of remittances in GDP in top 10 countries, the share is over 20% everywhere in the top 10. This is again underscores the fact that remittance flows are a lifeline to many smaller countries and poorer countries, and indeed in times of crisis, remittance flows prove to be more of a lifeline because migrants send more money home during those times. So just a small just byline, in the East Asia and Pacific region, the largest recipient is China, Philippines, and Vietnam and Indonesia. And yet again, as a share of GDP, countries like Tonga, Samoa, smaller countries, and then Philippines, the large country, and Kiribati, they have a higher share of remittances in GDP. The impact of the crisis on remittance flows is varied across the regions. Important message, everywhere there was resilience in all the regions. Remittances did not fall by as much as we were expecting, but there was variation. And in Latin America and the Caribbean region, remittances actually increased by 6.5%, in South Asia by 5.2%. And then if you go to Europe and Central Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, there was a decline of just under 10% in Europe and Central Asia and just under 13% in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there was different variation in the impact, and some countries were actually impacted very significantly by the crisis. Now, were we completely wrong in predicting a huge decline in remittance flows in 2020 first quarter, just after the lockdown began and the crisis related travel bans began? And the answer is probably not. Immediately in the aftermath of the lockdowns and travel bans in the second quarter last year, actually remittance flows plummeted in almost all the countries that have high frequency data, quarterly data. The decline was as high as 86% in Bulgaria compared to the year before. So it's not only Bulgaria, so Bolivia, Nigeria, Kazakhstan, there was a huge decline in remittance flows everywhere. And yet, by the third quarter and fourth quarter, there was a recovery in remittance flows. And that is remarkable. Now, what are the reasons for that recovery or the resilience starting third quarter and the fourth quarter? In fact, prior to that, what was the reason why second quarter the flows plummeted? To recollect the fact that the travel bans and the lockdown measures that were implemented rendered a large number of migrants not only to be unemployed, but also they were not able to go to send money because money transfer agents, companies, the shops were not open. Also, people who would carry money home physically, either when they're taking a plane or just crossing over by driving, let's say from US to Mexico or from South Africa to Zimbabwe, that kind of hand carry was also impacted by the crisis. That's why in second quarter, there was a huge decline in remittance flows. The third quarter and fourth quarter recovery had a lot to do with, first and foremost, the willingness of migrants to continue to support families. Migration is primarily motivated by remittances. People migrate to other richer countries, richer destinations where they can find a job because they are trying to escape poverty and unemployment, and they are trying to help their families, to support their families. So that willingness to support families becomes even much more important in times of crisis when the family is suffering even more, like the COVID-19 crisis. So that is the first and foremost reason behind the resilience of remittances, the willingness of migrants to continue to support families. That willingness was enabled by counter-cyclical fiscal policies that many large host countries implemented. There were cash transfer programs that benefited people as well as migrants, in the sense that there are many migrants who are employed, who are legal, who are even citizens of countries like the United States, the largest host country in the world, and they did benefit from direct cash transfers. They also benefited from employment support programs because that kept up the employment levels, maintained employment levels for migrants. And the economic outcome of the counter-cyclical fiscal policies actually translated into better economic performance in many large host countries. So if we look at the revisions to IMF's real GDP growth forecast, and this is kind of similar to the real GDP forecasts and outcomes for the year 2020, there were major upward revision as we progressed through the year. By the second quarter and end of the year, it was well known that the economy everywhere was performing better than previously expected in the beginning of the year, just around the peak of the crisis. So that was an important driver. And that is reflected in the employment levels of foreign-born workers as well as native-born workers in the United States. Now, United States has 51 million migrants or foreign-born people, and this is the largest host country in the world. So the employment situation here has implications for remittance flows globally, but particularly to Latin America and the Caribbean region. But I think that this picture of a sharp decline in April in employment levels, and then a fairly quick recovery, but partial recovery during the latter part of the year in second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. That picture, I think, is representative of the labor markets all over the world. The world was more prepared to work using digital means, remote work, and then the gig economy, the delivery systems, and all that. The world was more prepared than we were thinking last year, and I think that, together with the counter-cyclical fiscal policies, helped bring up resilience to the economies in most host countries, which then translated into remittance flows, resilience of remittance flows to developing countries. That said, we know that employment levels for foreign-born workers might take some time to recover. We already saw in this chart from the US employment levels that the recovery in employment levels for foreign-born workers has been slower and lower than that for native-born workers. Now, in the next chart, this chart, I'm showing the example from Euro after the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Both for foreign-born workers and native-born workers, unemployment rate increased in 2009. You can see the red line in 2009. Foreign-born workers' unemployment rate increased from 11% to 16%. But then over the subsequent years, 10 years later, let's say 2018 and 2019, for native-born workers, unemployment levels actually came down below the pre-global financial crisis level to 6.5%. But look at the unemployment rate for foreign-born workers. It still remains 11%. That is much higher than before. So the recovery in unemployment rate can take time, and it remains a downside risk to the outlook that I pointed out. So besides these three factors that I have already mentioned, willingness of migrants, countercyclical fiscal policies, and better than expected economic outcomes and employment outcomes, there was also a shift in the flows from cash to digital channels and also from informal to formal channels. The change from cash to digital happened because a lot of people just simply couldn't take cash and go to a money transfer company to send money, because handling cash itself was risky because of the contagion risks. Also, going to the stores was difficult, and money transfer companies were often not open. So there was a switch to digital channels. And also, carrying money by hand was not possible because of travel bans, especially international travel. And because of that, there was a switch from hand carry to more formal and probably banking and digital channels. So that also increased the level of remittances that are reported officially. One example of this, indirect evidence of the shift from cash to digital and informal to formal channels, indirect evidence is that when the World Bank conducted a survey, the COVID-19 high-frequency monitoring surveys, in countries like Mexico, Dominican Republic, in Gambia, in many African countries as well, a large number of households reported a fall in remittance receipts in the second quarter last year because of the crisis. At the same time, during the same quarter, central banks were reporting an increase in remittances. So in the case of Mexico, 35% of the households reported a fall in remittance receipts in second quarter. In Mexico, the central bank reported in the second quarter that there was a 10% increase in the remittance flows. But that kind of discrepancy can only be explained if there was some kind of a switch in the flows from informal to formal or from cash to digital. Weak oil prices have a huge effect on outward remittances from Russia in particular. And Russia is a major source of remittance flows to Central Asian countries like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Moldova. Oil prices became weak because of the crisis, which then weakened economic activity and employment levels of foreign-born workers from the Central Asian countries in Russia, and that resulted in lower outward remittances. There was also another effect. Because of lower economic activity and lower oil revenue, the ruble, the currency of of Russia, also weakened by 20-25%, which meant that the same amount of rubles flowing out from Russia to Tajikistan actually became 20% lower when expressed in US dollar term. So there was a valuation effect as well. Because of that, outward flows from remittances from Russia to countries like Kazakhstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, they declined by 37-38% last year. So that was definitely a major factor. Weak oil price was a major factor combined with the weak currency. Weak oil prices also affected outbound remittances from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf cooperation countries. And indeed, it is not only the cyclical effects of oil price. In the case of the Gulf cooperation countries, and in particular Saudi Arabia, there has been a more structural change in policy of reducing the number of foreign workers in the country and trying to increase the number of employed people or the employment rate of own workers, native workers, citizens. So between 2017 and 2020, the number of foreign workers in Saudi Arabia declined by about 3 million people out of a total of 8.5 million. So you can see this is a long-term secular trend of a reduction in foreign-born workers or foreign workers. This is going to continue in the future, and it would be a source of downside risks to the outward remittances from the region. And that would affect, in particular, South Asia and Southeast Asia and North Africa in a big way in terms of remittance flows. So aside from all these factors that I have already mentioned, there were some one-off factors that really came as a surprise to all of us. One such factor was the cancellation of the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Because of the travel bans, the travel to Saudi Arabia was cancelled, and that meant that almost 2 million people, migrant workers who travel for Hajj pilgrimage, migrant workers and their families who travel for Hajj pilgrimage, they could not travel. The same money was then sent as remittances. So that was one factor. That factor will continue to have an effect of an increase in remittance flows in July this year as well. Last year, there was another one-off factor which affected Bangladesh in particular. That is the effect of floods in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh actually remittances went up significantly last year, and that was a one-off thing. I don't know if that would continue going forward. By the way, floods and cyclones were also a factor in flows to Central American countries, in particular Honduras, because they had cyclones. So whenever there is a natural disaster, remittances tend to increase significantly. And now we know that when there is also a pandemic, remittances also increase significantly. Another country where there was a cyclical effect, and you could consider that also a bit of a one-off effect, was Mexico, where remittance flows actually continued to increase last year as though the crisis never happened. And only factor that we can point to is the fact that Mexican peso depreciated against the US dollar by 20-25% throughout last year. And that translates into cheaper things for migrants earning dollars Mexican goods, assets become cheaper, services become cheaper for migrants who are earning US dollars. So they send more money home to take advantage of that 20-25% discount, so to say. Now, that is a cyclical effect. I don't know how long the peso would continue to remain weak and how long that would carry the momentum of an increase in remittance flows to Mexico. By the way, Mexico is the largest remittance recipient country in Latin America region. So the outlook for remittances for this year, 2.6% increase, 2.2% next year again. And again, the pattern is very similar to what we observed in 2020, in the sense that Latin America and the Caribbean will have a 4.9% growth rate, South Asia and the Middle East will have slightly higher growth rates. Now, one interesting thing I wanted to mention before I move to the next part is that the 12.5% fall in sub-Saharan Africa, this is in the middle, you can see in 2020, there was a 12.5% fall in remittance flows. In 2021, we are expecting a 2.6% increase. That 12.5% fall in sub-Saharan Africa is entirely due to a 28% decline in remittance flows to Nigeria alone. Nigeria alone receives about 17 billion out of 42 billion that goes to the sub-Saharan Africa region, about 40%. And in Nigeria, remittance flows declined by 28% in 2020. If you exclude Nigeria, in the other countries in the region in sub-Saharan Africa, remittances actually increased by 2%, again pointing to resilience. So this outlook of over 2% growth rate, of course, carries significant downside risks. There is the possibility of the recurrence of COVID-19. It hasn't gone away. It is now raging in India. I don't know which other countries would be next. And it's not even clear how long before it goes away completely from countries like Japan or from United States. So this remains a risk, continues to remain a risk, possible recurrence of COVID-19. The shift from cash to digital also is not likely to continue at the same pace as in 2020, unless access to banking for migrants and their families and access to banking for money transfer operators improves. Access to banking is a precondition. Having a bank account and a credit card is a necessity for using online channels for remittances. So again, we have nearly 1.8 billion people in the world without bank accounts. So this is going to remain a major source of risk. And again, to put things in perspective, nearly 80 to 85% of remittances still go in the form of cash. They are not through online channels. Indeed, mobile money through mobile wallets, that has been growing very fast during the crisis. But according to the GSMA Association, which is the Association for Mobile Phone Operators, the total volume last year of mobile money remittances reached only $12 billion in the whole year, 12 billion out of 540 billion. So it's very small. Excuse me. The third source of downside risk is that counter-cyclical fiscal policy cannot be continued for long. That's an obvious point. Oil prices and currency exchange rates tend to be volatile. It's very hard to predict. So that would be a source of risk. And finally, one worrisome fact is sentiment against migrants might turn even more negative. There are not a lot of surveys and evidence on public perception towards immigration, but the sentiment survey towards immigrants that was carried out by Eurobarometer last July 2020, pointed out that negative sentiments towards migration has again overtaken positive sentiments. And this is going to be a risk going forward. My apologies. So my final part of the presentation is on policies. What are the policy responses in this time of crisis and post-crisis? We are not post-crisis yet. We are still in the continuation of crisis. One tangible policy instrument is that for reducing remittance costs. Remittance costs, the cost of sending money, $200 to another location across international borders, continues to be very high. It is about 6.4% in the first quarter of this year, and that is more than double the target that has been set by the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. The target is 3% by 2030. The current level is, the average level is 6.4%. And in Sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of sending money is over 8%. Now, every region, the cost of sending money is almost double the target set by the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you look at the lowest cost and highest cost corridors by different region, what is remarkable is that you have corridors like Russia to Georgia in Europe and Central Asia. From sending money from Russia to Georgia will cost you about 0.8%, so less than 1%. But then you go to Sub-Saharan Africa, Tanzania to Uganda, the cost could be as high as 24%, 23.7%. This is what it shows in this chart here. And indeed, in every region, take the example of East Asia and Pacific region, the cheapest corridor is Singapore to Philippines is 2.2% cost. The highest cost is South Africa to China is 17.8% cost. So you can see in every region there are major variations pointing to market segmentation, lack of competitiveness in the market, and also a simple fact that wherever banks are primarily used for sending remittances, the cost of sending money tends to be high because banks tend to be the costliest way of sending money. So more dedicated, specialized remittance service providers tend to be cheaper, and the newer ones that use online channels and mobile phone channels, they tend to be the cheapest. They tend to be the most efficient. That said, regulation tends to favor the banks or bank-based remittances, and it tends to frown on new startups that rely on online channels. And that remains a major problem. In the case of remittance costs in East Asia and Pacific, here is an example. These numbers are there in the report, in the migration and development brief, so I won't elaborate on them. But you can see that sending money from South Africa to China, Thailand to Indonesia, Thailand to China, Japan to Thailand. By the way, Japan to Brazil is also in the 11% range, and that's a significant remittance corridor. Remittance costs tend to be high everywhere, also in East Asia Pacific region, and in particular in Japan as well. Sending money from Japan to other parts of the world tends to be very costly, mainly because of reliance on sending money through banks in Japan. So with that, the final set of policy recommendations, the need to continue to support migrants, particularly migrants' access to vaccines need to be facilitated, because if migrants among our community don't have vaccines and they are not safe from the virus, then the community is not safe from the virus as well. So I think there is a very important message there that we need to really take care of vaccine needs for migrants and healthcare needs. And also migrants who are returning if they return in large numbers, then many countries like the Philippines or let's say India, the state of Kerala in particular in India, or Vietnam, um, these countries that are experiencing large return migration of their own people, they are overwhelmed and they also need support. There is also need to support migrants' families. Um, Many of them are left behind and they don't have access to vaccines, healthcare, education, and housing. That ought to be also part of the policy package, especially those who are in the informal sector, those who are lower skilled migrants and their families back home. And finally, on supporting remittance infrastructure, I have already talked about access to bank accounts for migrants, their families, as well as for money transfer companies. We need to understand what factors constrain such access to banking and then try to mitigate them. One factor that is known to affect access to banking as well as increase the cost of due diligence for remittance transactions is the regulations on countering money laundering and financing of terrorism. So anti-money laundering and countering of financing terrorism requirements, those regulations tend to increase the cost of customer due diligence, and that increases costs of remittances. Now, final point, there is really an urgent need to improve the collection of data on a timely basis. One reason we were surprised at the resilience of remittances was not because we don't follow remittance flows data on a daily basis. We follow the data on a daily basis, and yet we were surprised. And the reason we were surprised is because in many countries, remittance data are published with a lag of 3 months, 4 months, sometimes 6 months. And this is particularly problematic in sub-Saharan Africa. So you really don't have timely data. And there is an urgent need to improve the timeliness of publication of data on a high frequency basis, on a monthly basis actually. And also we need more granular data in the form of data on remittance channels, whether it is through online channels, mobile wallets, through banks or money transfer companies, or through checks or hand carry or informal channels in general. Also, we need granularity in terms of corridors. Is money going from Japan to Vietnam to Thailand to Burma to Nepal on Philippines? We need that kind of data on a country to country basis, but also ideally, we do want to know even from big cities to cities. So from Tokyo to Manila, Tokyo to Sao Paulo kind of data are also needed. So we are actually NOMAD, the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, together with the World Bank and in collaboration, hopefully with IMF, Eurostat, OECD, UN. We are actually planning to implement an international working group to improve data on remittances. Last time, a major progress was made on collection of data when we set up the Luxembourg group, and that led to the revision of IMF's balance of payments manual, and new definitions were introduced. That improved the data significantly. I think time has come again, now that more than 12 years have passed since then, to actually revisit the data questions and again improve the timeliness and the granularity and also the robustness of the data on remittances. With that, I would like to stop, and Koichi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dilip, for your presentation. We received many questions in advance, and also lots of questions coming in during your presentation. So let me read some of those questions. But first of all, for those of us who do not necessarily be, who are not necessarily be familiar with the NOMAD program, Would you please be able to explain a little bit about what Nomad program is doing? That's one. And then secondly, let me read a question from Nakamura-san from University of Tokyo. I'm surprised at the revision of the diminution of the international remittance upward. Is it the case that emergency subsidies by the government in home and host countries to immigrant or the impacted families affected the remittance? If so, how large the magnitude of the effect are? So that's a question from Nakamura-san. So I'd like to first ask you, Dilip, to respond to those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. Thank you for asking about Nomad as well. Nomad, which is short for Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development, is a global knowledge initiative. It is positioned as a brain trust for the global community to help design policy options to address the challenges of migration and to harness the benefits of migration. It is a multidisciplinary initiative because migration, if you approach it only through the economics lens or through the political science or through anthropology or sociology lens, then it would be a partial view, and migration really requires a multidisciplinary approach. But then if you have multidisciplinary approach, judging the appropriateness and robustness, analytical rigor, consistency of the knowledge outputs becomes a bit difficult because the metrics are different in different disciplines. So Nomad tries to bring together multidisciplinary experts and then come up with cross-disciplinary metrics to review and do quality control of our outputs. We produce data as well as we produce a large number of policy papers and knowledge papers, so working papers and data across sort of 9 thematic working groups. So we have one thematic working group is demographic change and data, which is very, very relevant for Japan. Labor migration, very, very helpful, very, very relevant for Japan again. Climate change and migration, internal migration, how to mobilize diaspora resources, including remittances, return migration, and forced migration. So there are 9 themes, and they are all on the website. So that's the short description of Nomad. And it is a trust fund, meaning that it is set up as a multidisciplinary, multi-donor trust fund, MDTF. It's a World Bank's multi-donor trust fund supported by European Commission, Switzerland, Agency for Development and Cooperation, and Germany, BMZ and GIZ. And besides those 3 donors, we are now hoping to mobilize more support from other donors as well. And I really wish that if there is an opportunity, we should have conversations for collaboration with Japan as well. On the substantive question, excellent question, on the effect of the fiscal stimulus programs on remittance flows. First, it's very clear, as you saw from the chart showing the trajectory of employment levels for foreign-born workers in the US, how it dipped in second quarter and then it continued to recover in third quarter and fourth quarter and lasting into the first quarter of this year. That is symptomatic of the cash transfer programs that were put in place in the United States. So there were direct cash transfer programs for individuals, and there were also employment support programs that were provided to small businesses and large businesses to keep people employed. And that directly helps, cash transfer programs directly benefits migrant workers as well. It indirectly affects migrant workers because through multiplier effect, when people spend money, that keeps employment levels up and generates incomes. So that also translates into incomes in the hands of people. And finally, there was also the willingness on the part of migrant workers to cut expenses, like save on consumption, save on rent, so that they can help families back home more. In that sense, every dollar that is somehow going to the migrant workers, there is a significant part that actually goes out to developing countries to serve as a lifeline to a large number of people, maybe millions of people in poorer countries.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. Let me continue reading the question from the one anonymous the viewers. We received many questions from this viewer, but let me go for the first two questions from this viewer. It is mentioned that the countries need to collect better data on remittances. How would the World Bank support such countries, including the shift from informal to formal channels of the remittances? That's one. Then the another one is what kind of support would the World Bank provide to the countries in order to reduce the cost of remittances? Are they combined with other projects like digital inclusion? How would the World Bank collaborate with other multilateral development banks or bilateral donors in this regard? So those questions, Dilip, over to you.
Excellent questions again. On the question of data, as I pointed out, World Bank actually spearheaded the Luxembourg group in 2017. And even prior to that, with the help of, at that time, G8, I remember Sea Island meeting of G8, which the US was chairing in 2003, I think. Data was an important topic at that time. That was a time when we first discovered that remittances had exceeded official aid. That was a World Bank discovery in a way. And that led to a chain of, well, that was life-changing for me in the sense that last 17 years, that's what I have done. Only remittances, mostly remittances and migration. So World Bank has been very active in trying to define the data, collect more data, and then set up systems in place and processes in place to improve the data. The last big one was the Luxembourg Group Initiative, where World Bank worked very closely with the UN Statistics Department and the IMF and the BIS and Eurostat and 25 other countries to improve the definition of data on remittances as well as the collection of data on remittances. That led to the revision of the balance of payments manual of the IMF. And once that happens, then countries begin to report according to the new definition. So by now, not most, but actually 100 countries or so are already reporting data according to the new definition. That said, there are countries, many of them in Africa, that are still using 10-year or 15 or 20-year-old definitions and methodology. So there is clearly a need to bring them up to date. And World Bank is engaging with central banks. And now with a new international working group on data, we hope to engage more with, again, the international community. The same players probably will be there, UN, IMF, Eurostat, OECD, other organizations, but also with countries. We want to work with them to provide technical assistance and set up systems so that better data can be collected. A part of that exercise has to be to understand informal flows and how do we define informal flows. And I think we would need to do surveys of money transfer companies and surveys of households on how they receive money. That would be part of the data effort as well. On the question of remittance costs, we are a custodian of the SDG indicator to reduce remittance costs. So we have set up something called the Remittance Prices Worldwide Database that produces data on about 400 remittance corridors in the world on a quarterly basis. The latest quarter data was published about a week ago, and that is for the first quarter of 2021. So that database is publicly available and it is quite user-friendly. Besides that, we are working with central banks and the Financial Action Task Force and the Treasury Department and the G20 in particular to look at financial integrity issues and the regulations surrounding customer due diligence, know your client requirements, that AML CFT that I mentioned. Plus, there is a huge undertaking in the World Bank to improve financial access, financial inclusion of households. So we are collaborating, and part of that is, of course, the digital channels as well, shifting to digital channels. And in all of this, there is collaboration with not only other MDBs, but also with the Gates Foundation, for example, or Open Society Foundation, MacArthur Foundation. There is collaboration with them.
Thank you for your responses. Let me move on to read the questions posted on the chat screen during your presentation. First, Professor Yoshino from Keio University, thank you very much for your question. Thank you for excellent presentation. There are many examples where overseas work experience brought new business into their home country. So that's one. Second one, the question from Taka Yabe. Thank you very much, Yabe-san. Thank you for your presentation. I'm interested in how communities respond to shocking such as COVID and natural hazard. Do you also observe remittance resilience during acute and regional disasters like flood? So those are two questions I would like to ask Dilip to come in and respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent questions again. We talked a lot about how migrants support their countries through remittances. So remittances are actually now one of the most tangible links between migration and development. So besides that, we know that migrants also invest in their countries. So migrants and diasporas, I mean, I am using the term almost interchangeably. Migrants invest in their home country. They also migrant networks are a significant source of networking for trade purposes. So trade promotion is very common that you have family networks that are actually across different countries, and that is actually very, very true in East Asia. We know the role of family networks in China and in Japan, Korea as well. But also migrants' own networks also facilitate trade in a significant way between Philippines and Singapore, or between China and everywhere in the world. They also facilitate investments. There is also the link of philanthropy, and then there is the link of skill transfers, technology transfers, and then there is the influence in the form of affecting values back home. So migrants have seen a different world, and they bring a lot of knowledge, and the values they get, they transmit that back home. So an interesting example there is that if you look at Moroccan families that have migrants in migrant workers in the Gulf region versus migrant workers in Europe, the family size is different, and the fertility rate of women is different in those families. So these are sort of the value things that you can impart. You can interpret. Oh, okay. So that was sort of the simple point that migrants can be a huge force for creating new businesses back home, both through knowledge as well as providing business investments. A significant part of investment remittances are for that purpose also. And especially in times of crisis, they also provide money for seed money or bridge loans to tide over the crisis. So this is happening anecdotally. Unfortunately, there is not enough data right now, in part because of the difficulty of conducting household surveys. You don't want to face people. Sometimes when the surveys were conducted, people fell sick with the COVID. So it has become very difficult. So we are now relying on mobile phone surveys. So there'll be increasing data coming out, and I think we will find that evidence. That brings me to the community response question. An immediate question that comes to example that comes to mind is what is happening in India right now for the last 3 weeks or so, with the COVID crisis ranging with the COVID crisis becoming so intense in India. A lot of diaspora members, including World Bank staff, are actually gathering their groups, diaspora groups, And not only they are sending money, but more importantly, they are also sending oxygen cylinders. So actually, World Bank staff have sent oxygen cylinders from places like Kazakhstan, from Beirut, from Manila, from South Africa. It's just incredible. Of course, from Europe and from, I'm sure, from Japan as well. So there is a significant literature now on the role of community, diaspora communities or hometown associations in facilitating philanthropic contributions or collective remittances to their own communities back home. This remains an interesting channel on a smaller scale, but you can actually increase the number of such organizations. So hometown associations can be supported for supporting their communities back home.
Thank you very much, Dilip, for your responses. So for the rest of a few minutes, let me read two more questions from the viewers posted on the chat screen and ask you to respond together with your final remarks to the viewers in Japan. First question from Akiko Ida-san from JICA. Any observation on a different impact of COVID on remittances by gender and the education level? So that's one. The second question from Ben Arnold de Vera. Thank you for your question. Would renewed lockdowns in some host countries be a significant downside risk to global remittance flows? And to just add, would renewed lockdowns in recipient countries also, just like last year, force migrant workers to send money, more money back home so their families could better cope? So those gender education question and lockdown question, and I would ask you, Dilip, to come in together with your final remarks to the viewers in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. On impact on gender or gender differentiated impact, there is not a lot of evidence on that yet. You know, one region where there have been civil society actions, so to say, was the Gulf countries, where we know that a large number of migrants are mainly single male, and they're in the construction and hotels and well, they're in every part of the society there. But there is also a significant group, which is women working as domestic help in many households. And domestic help, interestingly, those who are living in the family, there is no lockdown for them. In fact, if at all, they are working all the time. So that's good and bad. Actually, I don't know if it is bad. It could be bad in the sense that there might be too much burden on them, or they might be forced to take risks, perhaps. But there is no good evidence yet on the gender dimension of the crisis. Actually, we could look into our household survey, the high-frequency surveys that we mentioned, to see if we can draw some lessons. That would be something for me to do. So thank you for the suggestion. On education, there has been huge impact in a very negative way, simply because, again, this also begins to talk about the lockdown effects. You know, educational facilities were affected, and in the remittance recipient countries, the developing countries which receive remittances mostly, in those countries, schools were shut down, and a lot of people don't have, poorer families don't have access to even phones. So I know of anecdotes where in Africa, in Asia, including in South Asia, teachers were sending voice messages on normal phones to teach. And they were sending videos somehow through WhatsApp to teach, and videos that were recorded on WhatsApp, right, on mobile phones. And many of them were not provided mobile phones or smartphones by the government. They were using their own personal things. So, you know, it has been a major disruption in the education sector. And I think that would have longer term impact. On the question of lockdown, in the immediate aftermath in second quarter, there was a major disruption in terms of people's ability to go and send money, cash. Actually, I know of one particular case where a housewife in India, it seems she got COVID because of handling cash for the family business. She wasn't even stepping out of the house, but she got it. So cash business became a little bit risky. And because of that, there was a switch to um, digital channels, and even within digital channels, contactless channels. But has that gone around in the world at large? No, not yet. So lockdown has had profound effect on the way we work and the way we send money, and it will continue to have that for a long time to come, both in some positive ways and some negative ways. So with that, the final thing that I would like to say, these are my remarks, couple of things. One, we really can't underestimate the importance of taking care of people who are living among us and working with us in our communities. So access to vaccine has to be universal as much as possible. And we would risk the world as a whole will remain unsafe unless we really take care of everyone, because this is a global problem. So that would be my most important message, closing remarks. And the second closing remark, more pertaining to remittances, is that we know that the world would need to move to digital channels and will gradually move towards digital channels. But normally, high-skilled people will not have any difficulty. Those with access to banking will not have any difficulty. But for those for whom remittances truly acts as a financial lifeline, many of those are in the informal sector. They are lower-skilled people. They are poorer people. They need access to bank accounts, and we really need to improve access to bank accounts for them. So with that, I would like to thank you, and thank you for Koichi as well for giving me another opportunity.
Thank you very much. With us this morning from Washington was Dilip Lasa, the World Bank's leader economist and head of Nomad. Dilip, thank you very much for spending your time doing the second round of presentation on the same day on the report. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So next week, we are featuring a new report titled Long Shadow of Informality, which was released on May 11th. Our future speaker next week will be the co-editor of the report, Francisca Onezoge, manager, and Shu Yu, the senior economist, both from the Prospect Group. This is going to start at 8 a.m. on Friday, June 4th in Japan Standard Time. With that, I'd like to once again thank you everyone for tuning in. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next week. Thank you.